Want a table in your micro camper but can't justify the space? Oh, I've got the perfect space-saving solution that won't compromise your layout. Let me show you how. I've made the table frame out of oak and repurposed mahogany using box or finger joints. The table is suspended within the existing frame using shoulder bolts and oilite bearings. The shoulder bolt has an unthreaded cylindrical section, the shoulder, between the head and the threads, allowing my oilite bearings to rotate around it. Oilite bearings, made from sintered bronze, are porous and self-lubricating, designed to reduce friction by releasing oil under movement. The result is incredibly smooth. The table's finished off with a Bales catch, allowing it to click firmly into place. If you'd like to see more projects like this, then subscribe to my channel below. I've made a lot of videos already. Just last week, for example, I made this pull-out tray for my HomePod. Enough about the past and future though. Let's come back to the present, where I show you how I made the table. Since I'm using finger joints for my table, the entire project is dictated by the diameter of the router bit. I've chosen a 10mm bit and I want 3 fingers per piece, which means the timber must be exactly 60mm wide. Be sure to test and adjust on a scrap piece of wood to ensure that the fingers fit together perfectly later on. A good rule of thumb is to use timber that is exactly double the thickness of the diameter of your router bit. I'll explain the reason for this shortly. There are many complicated methods for cutting finger joints on a router, but this one is by far the simplest I've come across. It does, however, require screwing into your workbench, so if you're happy with that, you're good to go. To set up your fence, use a straight length of wood. Screw down one end, then adjust the other side until the bit is aligned with the edge of the timber closest to you. To safely cut your joints, clamp your timber to a backing board. We'll call this a jig. The jig should be long enough to keep your fingers at a safe distance from the bit during each pass. You'll also want to ensure the jig is at least as wide as the piece of timber you're cutting to avoid tear out. As mentioned earlier, the timber should be double the thickness of the diameter of the router bit. So in my case, 20mm thick oak and a 10mm router bit. This allows for perfect alignment when offsetting the fence for the next cut, ensuring you end up with 10mm fingers and 10mm gaps. When cutting joints on different materials, the depth of the cut should match the thickness of the material it will join with. For example, cut 20mm deep on the 1-inch mahogany and 1 inch deep on the 20mm oak. The offset remains unchanged because it's determined by the width, not the thickness of the timber. Complete all cuts for one material before adjusting the bit height to avoid unnecessary changes. Before gluing, the next step was to bore the holes to accommodate the oilite bearings. For this, I made a 22mm template and used it with my palm router to ensure that the holes were perfectly straight. Next, I glued up the frame and inserted the bearings. The frame was slightly oversized, so I trimmed it to the correct dimensions on the table saw. The process for cutting holes on the frame was exactly the same, but I took extra care to ensure that all the holes were perfectly aligned. Satisfied with the fit, I superglued the bearings into place and moved on to cutting the opening in the face panel. My approach here differed. For the other openings, I used the router, but here I needed to preserve the cutout as I wanted to use it on the front of the table frame. A flush trim bit would have removed too much material. Instead, I used a track saw to cut precisely between the lines that I had traced from behind by removing this cupboard. The result? A beautiful continuous grain across the face panel. Finally, I used some button fixings to secure the tabletop in place. I'm looking for suggestions as to what I can store inside, so let me know in the comments section below. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing if you haven't already done so. Next up on the channel, I'll show you how I installed this Max Fan dome vent. I'll see you then.